But Mark Carney, I mean, going back to Mark Carney, did do a masterful job of managing Donald Trump's ego and his personality. We have commentators here in the States who are saying, he's really sort of figured out how do you confront Trump without having it be a total blow up.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Charlie Sykes on the show. He's a political commentator and author of How the Right Lost Their Mind. We speak to him about this Washington Post article where Donald Trump allegedly reached out to the Ukrainian government in late January and asked if they could basically deport illegal migrants from the US to war-torn Ukraine. So a pretty insane story there. We also speak to him about this meeting between Mark Carney and Donald Trump, how civil it was, the fact that Mark Carney stood up for Canada, and what would happen if the relationship between the two countries became more fragile than it already is. We've also spoken to him about this interview with Joe Biden. He sat for a BBC interview for the first time since leaving office, and he spoke about his decision to walk away from his re-election campaign. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Charlie Sykes, a political commentator and author of How the Right Lost Their Mind. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's good to have you on the program. There's so much to go through in what has been another week in Trumpland. And I want to start off with this article from the Washington Post. It's a pretty damning report where the Washington Post obtained various documents, and they allege that in late January, after Donald Trump was sworn in, he basically asked the Ukrainian government, and we don't know how high up level this went, but he asked the Ukrainian government if they could take some of their illegal migrants from the United States and deport them into Ukraine. Now, this was at a time when Ukraine didn't even have a proper airport system because Russia had been attacking their airports, and of course during a wartime in the country. So when you're reading this report, whether or not we know if it's 100% true, because of course the Trump administration haven't responded to it, but whether or not this is true, what is your reaction to this, Charlie?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Look, Donald Trump's reversal of position on Ukraine, I think, has been one of the most extraordinary things of his second presidency. Watching the United States, in a sense, change sides in the Cold War, but the relationship with Ukraine goes back a long way. I mean, he's been trying to extort the Ukrainians for some time. His first impeachment actually involved that phone call where he was trying to link an arms sale to President Zelensky's willingness to dig up dirt on the Biden family. So this goes back a long way. But again, the whole notion, this renditioning of migrants to foreign countries has really become kind of an ugly chapter. I mean, it's bad enough that we're sending migrants to that notorious prison in El Salvador, but now we're getting these reports of shipping people off to, well, allegedly Ukraine. That's not going to happen, obviously, but places like Libya, and there's a certain nightmarish dystopian quality to all of this.
We know, Charlie, that there's obviously been a massive problem when it comes to illegal migration in the United States. That's not something that anyone would disagree on. It was horrific numbers under the Biden administration, and Donald Trump is obviously trying to clean up that mess in the way that he wants to, and he has got these partners. He's got El Salvador, as you mentioned. He's got Mexico, Costa Rica, and Panama that have all agreed to take migrants from various other countries from the United States and take them into their countries to basically alleviate the stress of illegal migration. But Donald Trump requesting to send migrants to Ukraine as they try and broker a peace deal, try and broker a ceasefire, try and get Ukraine back on track, when Ukraine obviously does not have the upper hand in this situation, would you say that this was incredibly tone deaf from Donald Trump to be wanting to send illegal migrants to a country in the midst of a war?
Well, it's tone deaf, but it also is very revealing about the way that he makes decisions. He kind of just throws stuff up against the wall. Where did that idea come from? Who thought that that was a good idea? And his position essentially tends to be that if someone is weak and wants something from me, I will demand anything that I can. Whether it's American law firms or whether it's other countries with the tariffs. And he thinks that Ukraine owes the United States. He thinks he's got leverage with Ukraine to make them cut any sort of a deal. They did get the mineral deal this past week, but in Donald Trump's mind, he sort of have the list. These are things I want. These are people who I'm going to bully into giving it to me. So yes, this would be pretty much on brand, actually, as tone deaf as it is.
And of course, we weren't told how many migrants he had requested to deport to Ukraine. We weren't told if the upper levels of government in Ukraine even took this proposal seriously. So it's just an interesting thing, and at a very interesting time, Charlie, in late January when he'd only just been sworn in, that he basically had asked the Ukrainian government if they would do this, when they're obviously in a vulnerable situation as the administrations turn over. So it was a bizarre situation, one anyone wouldn't have expected. But I'm going to move on to this meeting between newly elected Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, and Donald Trump, meeting for the first time after a very tumultuous few months. We wondered if Mark Carney would antagonize Donald Trump. We wondered if Donald Trump would behave. We wondered if it would be civil. And to an extent, it was pretty civil. But we did see Mark Carney say to Trump that Canada was not up for sale and it never would be. How do you think this meeting went?
Well, these meetings in the Oval Office have become little dramas, haven't they? You don't know whether someone's going to come in and be berated or whether or not it's going to be a love fest. But I thought the main takeaway from that was that Mark Carney sat there a few feet away from the president and said that to his face. We are not selling Canada. Canada is not for sale. It will never happen. And so he looked Donald Trump right in the eye and told him no, which is, not an experience that Trump particularly enjoys. Then Trump responds later by saying, we'll never say never. Prime Minister Carney had just said never. It's never going to happen. And I thought it was interesting that a reporter asked Mark Carney later, what was going through your mind when Donald Trump was going through his various riffs about trade and Canada becoming a stay? What was going through your mind? And he said, you really don't want to know. I really don't want to say what was going through my mind. But it's always an interesting question what these world leaders are thinking as they're sitting in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, who is sometimes insulting them to their face or making up stories or trying to pressure them or sometimes trying to charm them. What is actually going through their minds?
And we did wonder what kind of approach Mark Carney would take, Charlie, because of course we saw that blow up in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky. And then in the aftermath of that, we saw Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron really having to rein it in and learn how to control themselves. Not that they don't know how, but of course they had to play the game a little. They had to stroke his ego a little bit. And I thought Mark Carney, he did a great job of being able to stick up for Canada, but also remaining relatively civil. But do you think that this is the last time we'll hear from Donald Trump calling Canada the 51st state?
Oh, absolutely not. No. When Donald Trump gets an idea stuck in his head, he's going to loop it around for years, if not decades. I mean, the whole tariff issue is something that he's been talking about since the 1980s. So no, he will bring it up. Obviously, there's not a systematic plan involving the United States and Canada. The fact that Donald Trump would have trolled the Canadians about making them their 51st day on Election Day is an indication that there's a little bit more id than planning going on here.
Trump, he after the meeting, he went on True Social or whatever social platform he went on, Charlie, and he basically said Canada needs everything from the United States and all the US wants is their friendship. He obviously was mentioning business deal, trade deal, but this is despite the fact he went online and said that, despite the fact that the US's total trade dealings in 2024 with Canada was around $600 billion, which included $400 billion of imports from Canada. So I wonder what the motive from Donald Trump was when he went and wrote that message on Twitter or on True Social.
Well, I mean, this is the nice Donald Trump as opposed to the Donald Trump with the big stick. But the numbers that you just gave, I think, are really important because at one point Trump was saying during that meeting that, well, we don't do that much business with Canada, that we don't really need them. And then people came up with these numbers, and I'm not sure how many Americans understand how important Canada is as a trading partner to the United States, although we're about to find out.
In the event that the relationship does become a bit more tense, Charlie, we do see this back and forth. We do see Mark Carney having to really approach this in a different way, in a more antagonising way, in a more way that he needs to be a little bit more vocal. Do you think that the fallout of this relationship is incredibly detrimental to both countries?
Well, it would be. Any kind of a trade war will lead to two losers, and so far Donald Trump has been willing to engage in this elaborate game of chicken with the world economy. We don't know what will happen. Trump will often find a face-saving way to back down. He'll just simply claim a victory. They'll claim some sort of a deal. It may not be anything new whatsoever. But Mark Carney, going back to Mark Carney, did do a masterful job of managing Donald Trump's ego and his personality. We have commentators here in the States who are saying, he's really sort of figured out how do you confront Trump without having it be a total blow up. So that would be, if I was a Canadian, I would be somewhat optimistic going forward. The problem is, and everybody's in the same boat here, we have an economy by whim. What determines who gets tariffed and how much? Donald Trump in the middle of the night with his thumbs on Truth Social, and no one knows where they're going. The level of uncertainty is tremendous for American businesses, but for any other country that doesn't know whether they're going to show up on his list, his naughty or nice list.
Oh, absolutely. It is a little bit like a naughty and nice list. But I want you mentioned Canadians, and I want to read out a few stats because it was really interesting to see Donald Trump weigh in and interfere, some would say, with the Canadian election late last month. Now, during that time, an Ipsos poll found that after the cost of living, Canadians' next most important issue, 24% of Canadians thought the fractured relationship with the United States was their leading issue. Another poll said that they had more trust in Mark Carney to handle Trump than any other candidate. Now, Trump, we saw him take a little bit of ownership for Mark Carney's win because Canadians were so concerned with Donald Trump. But regardless of that, what do you think this says about the relationship between the two neighbours, especially when you have Canadians actually coming out and say that I'm electing a leader that I think can deal with Donald Trump?
Well, there's no question about it. That election was determined by the Donald Trump factor. The Liberals were on track to lose that election by an absolute landslide until Donald Trump began his trolling. And I will say that there are a lot of things about the Trump second term that, frankly, don't surprise me because Donald Trump's been telling us who he is, what he wants to do for a long time. But the alienation of Canada is truly remarkable. If there are any two people who have a stronger friendship than Americans and Canadians, I can't really think of it. And there's been no animosity. There's been really no significant friction. And to see how quickly Donald Trump has made Canadians, anti-American seems a little bit strong, but there is an anti-American stream going through all of this, booing Americans booing at a hockey game, the mass cancellation of vacations to the United States, the boycott of American products. And Canada, why Canada? We have a satirical comic cartoon show in this country called South Park, and one of their running gags was, blame Canada, let's have a war with Canada, because the idea of a conflict with Canada is so thoroughly absurd, and yet this is something that leapt fully formed out of the mind of Donald Trump. And I'm not sure that you're going to be able to put that relationship back. Once you break trust, how do you get it back? And so many of the people who were America's strongest allies and strongest friends are now looking at us and going, we don't recognize you, we can't count on you, we can't rely on you, we're not even sure you're on the same side anymore. And that's going to be the work of decades, I think, to restore some of those broken relationships.
And it takes a lot to upset a Canadian, Charlie, because we know that they're the nicest bunch around, certainly nicer than us Australians or us Brits or us Americans. taken. So it's just taken over 100 days to fracture that relationship. But I want to move on to another country that Donald Trump, for some reason, seems is up for grabs. According to the Wall Street Journal, US intelligence agencies were told last week to step up their spying on Greenland. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard has directed the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the National Security Agencies to gather more information on Greenland, including focusing on identifying individuals in both Greenland and Denmark who support Trump's interests in taking over the island. What is your reaction to this?
Well, when this first came up, I thought, well, this is a typical Donald Trump distraction because we're not taking Greenland. As time goes on, though, I think it's becoming more alarming. Over the weekend, he gave an interview to NBC News where he was asked whether he would use military force against Canada or Greenland. And he said, well, probably not Canada. Well, thank God for that. But he did not rule it out for Greenland. So the possibility of the President of the United States putting on the table the possibility of military action against one of our own NATO allies, I mean, it is breathtaking, but I will say this, that there are certain scenarios in 2025 and 2026 where the economy or some other crisis occurs where Donald Trump will want a really, really big distraction. And Greenland could be that distraction. And the fact that they're now, stepping up spying would indicate that at least some level of Donald Trump's psyche, they are serious about this. And again, this is one of those things with Donald Trump, watching Donald Trump, it's so sometimes difficult. When is it just a joke? When is it a troll? When is it something that we have to think this might actually happen? And I think over and over again, increasingly, we're finding out that with Trump, these things might actually happen now in this second term.
And it's feeling like opposite day, Charlie, because you have him ramping up spying on Greenland, but then you have also Pete Hegseth halting US cyber commands in terms of spying on Russia in order to get Russia on their side to broker this deal. But you mentioned this interview. I want to read out the quote for our listeners. He said in an interview last week that we need Greenland very badly. Greenland is a very small number of people. We'll take care of them. We'll cherish them, all that. But we need that for international security. And of course, he didn't rule out military force to annex the island, as you mentioned. Now, is he singing a familiar tune, Charlie? Because this is sounding very Putin-esque, and it's sounding exactly what Xi Jinping plans to do with Taiwan.
Well, that's the most disturbing part, that you get the sense that he is looking at the world in terms of various gigantic spheres of influence, and the logic there of invading and seizing Greenland, confiscating Greenland, would be pretty much the same as Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine or President Xi going after Taiwan. This is not the American way. This is not the way what the world thought that American leadership would be, but he does have the idea that this big, giant, beautiful country, you just tack it on to the United States and look what it looks like on a map. But what it would take would be breathtaking. I mean, the fact that we're even discussing this, the United States going back to sort of the manifest destiny imperium is something that was not on most voters' bingo cards, I don't think.
Oh, no, I think that that's been one of the more surprising elements to these 100 days. But I want to move on to someone that we haven't mentioned in a really long time, Joe Biden. He sat for his first interview since leaving office. He sat for an interview with BBC. He condemned Trump for proposing that Russia should keep Crimea. They should keep that 20% of occupied land that they've taken since the war began in February 2022. He said, it's a modern day appeasement. I just don't understand how people think that if we allow a dictator, a thug, to decide that he's going to take significant portions of land that aren't his, that's going to satisfy him. I don't quite understand. So I want your response to Joe Biden weighing in on this US proposal from Donald Trump, where he said to Russia and Ukraine that perhaps in order to broker a deal, Russia would be able to keep that 20% of land that they've occupied, and of course Crimea, which they took in 2014.
Well, I mean, it is, in fact, appeasement. We have a long tradition in the United States of former presidents not speaking out about their successors for some time. Obviously, all those norms have been set aside, and I'm glad that Joe Biden is speaking out about what's going on here. And I think that Biden is reflecting probably the consensus of world leaders, certainly our own allies, that why would you think that giving Vladimir Putin what he wants, appeasing him, is going to make Europe safer, make the world safer. And I think one of the extraordinary things that we've seen, though, is not just Donald Trump's willingness to give Vladimir Putin everything he wants without getting anything in return, parroting his propaganda, but also the fact that Vladimir Putin continues to kind of thumb his nose at Donald Trump, his good buddy. He was really humiliating him by constantly rejecting these overtures, by not ending the war. And you sense a little bit of frustration on Trump's part, but I think he's too deep down the rabbit hole of being Vladimir Putin's buddy and friend to reverse course.
Absolutely. But in another sense, to play devil's advocate, Charlie, we know that obviously Donald Trump, he's put a lot of trust in Vladimir Putin. Some of us do believe that perhaps he's been played like a fiddle. But my thoughts are in order to play devil's advocate in terms of Joe Biden, I wonder if he has a leg to stand on. Of course, he was great in giving as much military aid, foreign aid to Ukraine during his term. But Trump has at least got Putin to the negotiating table. And it did feel as if Biden hadn't really tried.
Well, Biden has been trying by raising the cost of this genocidal invasion of Ukraine. And I'm not even sure we're at that moment there, Vladimir Putin is not really in the interest of negotiating a settlement. He wants surrender. He wants a triumph. And I think that both Joe Biden and the other leaders of NATO understood that. I don't think that Donald Trump understands that. Look, Joe Biden has a mixed record on this. I give him high grades for bringing the alliance together and giving the weapons that Ukraine got. On the other hand, we are here because of the slow walking of much of that aid. I think in retrospect, you look back and you think, you know what? American policy was to keep Ukraine from losing, never giving them quite enough to win. And that reluctance to do what it took to win that war, I think, has led us into this stalemate, into the moment we're in right now. So Joe Biden has a mixed record on Ukraine.
Yeah. I want to get your thoughts on a comment he said in this BBC interview, Charlie. He was asked about his decision to drop out of his race for re-election. He dropped out in mid-July 2024, which left Kamala Harris, the new nominee, about 107 days to campaign for election. A lot of people believe that limited time in campaigning really did kind of hinder her ability to win the race. But he was asked on the fact that he dropped out in mid-July, and he said that he didn't think it mattered if he should have dropped out a little bit before that. I want to get your thoughts on whether you think the Democratic Party, within the Democratic Party as members, as people who work in the Democratic Party, but also as voters, if they believe that.
Some of them do, but I think there's a growing consensus that this was a disaster. Not just the fact that he waited till 107 days before the election to drop out, but that he had not done so years ago, that he hadn't made it clear that he was going to clear the field. And there's been a series of books that are now coming out here talking about the degree to which his problems were being covered up by his staff, that there was this delusion that somehow, that even in decline, that he would be able to beat Donald Trump and serve a second term. And you look back on that as really, I think it's becoming clearer and clearer what a fundamental mistake that was. I mean, a really historic mistake. If, in fact, Donald Trump represented an existential threat to American democracy, then the decision by Trump and his the decision by Joe Biden and his family and his staff to keep his deteriorating condition under wraps, I think is one of the more deplorable episodes in American political history.
And it is interesting that ended up being such a bipartisan thought process, Charlie, because you saw so many people barracking for him, believing he could make it. And then, of course, we saw that insane presidential debate that really turned a corner for the Democrats. And it's just so interesting when you're in the middle of a presidential campaign, how just one event can really switch the gears and they go into panic mode and crisis mode. So just kind of to wrap up the interview, I want to get your thoughts on Trump's comments yesterday. He wants to reopen Alcatraz.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a sort of a cartoonish idea. I mean, for the viewers, this is not going to happen. Alcatraz was closed in 1963. It is now a museum. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to reopen it, tens of millions of dollars to operate it, and it's one of the most efficient prisons in the world because it's on an island, so you can't get stuff to it. But Donald Trump is flailing around for ways to show that he's the law and order president, and apparently, and this is not a joke, apparently he was watching a movie about Alcatraz. There was a recent replay of the Clint Eastwood movie Escape from Alcatraz. And at first I thought this was just snarky commentators saying it. But then when Donald Trump was asked at a press conference, why Alcatraz, the first words out of his mouth were, well, I was supposed to be a movie producer and Alcatraz is in all these movies. And it's like, okay, so this is the way your mind works. You want to show that you're tough on crime, but you come up with this idea from 50, 60 years ago because your mind is basically a cartoon show.
You want to be tough on crime, and yet you want to reopen Alcatraz where prisoners actually successfully escaped the prison. So that doesn't make any sense.
That's where they closed it.
Charlie Sykes, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.